We have another question from the audience. Andrew, has Andrew got a question?
Thank you.
Thank you.
As a presenter to the New South Wales Legislative Council DV inquiry and the Senate inquiry into domestic violence, I know both inquiries recognise the existence of male victims of violence by women. Both recognise these male victims experience the same pain and distress as female victims. Both inquiries acknowledge that these male victims are not able to access feminist-controlled domestic violence services. Despite it being 3 years since the release of the New South Wales report, men are still not able to access the feminist-controlled services which are receiving public funds to support victims. Does this mean that these services will in fact never support men, and therefore we need men's services, controlled by men and with quarantine funding?
Thank you. Maybe Michael might have something to say on that.
Yeah, sure. You know, when we look at violent relationships, they are really complicated, and you know, we do see a level of violence in relationships is often, when I say low level, I mean we see pushing, we see shoving, we see punching sometimes from both parties, and this is a real challenge, I think, for police, particularly when they do attend an incident and there's injuries on both parties. I think it's a mistake for us to take the framework that we've developed to explain women's experience of domestic violence and then just translate it onto men and say, well, you know, if women are experiencing this kind of violence, therefore men's experience of violence must be equivalent, it must be the same, and therefore men have the same, male victims of DV have generally the same needs that female victims of DV have. So I think it's really important that we respond to men's experience of victimisation for what it is. As Heather said, men are primarily not being injured and dying at home. They're being injured and dying on the streets. Now, that's not to say that we don't allocate resources for men who are experiencing violence in their relationships, but we need to give them the right response. When men's shelters have been opened overseas, they haven't been used. Okay, so they've been opened overseas. We had a male-only DV shelter that was open in Canada for about 3 years with public funding, and it recorded, I think it was 1 or 2 clients over that 3 years. And what that indicates is simply that's not the right response. That's not what those men need. So I think paying attention to need and meeting need for men who are experiencing violence in their relationships, regardless of who the perpetrator is, I think that's the key.
Jan?
I would agree with what Michael just said, and I'd also add that it's actually from research that Michael and I undertook together that we also saw when we spoke with adult survivors of child sexual abuse, most of the men wanted to have mixed services. Most of the women didn't. And some of that was to do with feeling unsafe with men being there because for them, mostly the perpetrator had been male. And to some extent, we have to listen to what people want or what services they find effective. Now, that's not to say that there shouldn't be services for men, but simply looking at whether, and not all of the women's refuges are feminist run, that I think that that's not correct. I'm sure Uniting Care would not think that they were a feminist organisation. But I do think that, you know, simply saying, well, women have got refuges, let's open them to men, I don't think that's effective any more than it would be saying, okay, we've got elder abuse, let's put anyone suffering elder abuse into a women's refuge, or we've got a trans person who clearly does not feel comfortable being positioned as a woman, putting that trans person in a women's refuge. It is about being more nuanced. It's recognising the complexity and trying to develop responses that are appropriate for particular individuals. Not just saying, well, one group's got resources and we want them. I don't think that works.
Yeah, thank you. Garvey wants to. Thank you. Garvey.
I would say that in my own experience with refuges, I actually think that maybe it's an important thing when people say men don't need these services. This is a really good example of how this conversation plays out, because in fact there are a number of gay and bi men's refuges around the world that are in high use. There are a number of trans refuges that are in high use. There are even some safe home programs in places where people don't have the resources to have an actual refuge, where they have a safe home program, where they have carefully vetted people who open their homes as safe houses, And there are a number of those programs around the world that are very widely used by women, men, and people of any gender. I think one of the points to also make about this is that, you know, sociologist Margaret Eichler talked about the big blob theory of sexism, this idea that people just say anything that's bad for women is sexism, and they just stop there. I think that there are many different types of sexism, and some of them lead to a trajectory that ends in physical violence, some of them don't, and they all have different solutions and interventions. So when we have an overly generalized approach that lumps everything in together, it isn't that helpful. And the traditional power and control wheel that was often used, and I know because I used to work as a frontline direct service provider for a shelter, I know that power and control wheel does not work for a lot of people because the way that it works assumes a certain type of dynamic that just doesn't take into account a lot of cultural factors. And, you know, there was one story that still chills me to this day. There was a woman who'd been assaulted by her partner, and this woman somehow got a caseworker who couldn't call her she, which she identified as a woman, but her paperwork all said male. Now, this woman was assaulted by another woman. She somehow ended up in the care of an LGBTI program that frankly didn't know how to deal with people of trans experience. So this woman came in there and people sort of said, oh, LGBTI will throw you over there, they'll know what to do with you. The program was primarily good at dealing with gay and lesbian people, but not any of the other letters that were on their roster. And so what happened was, and this is very common unfortunately, so what happened was she became a bit hostile because they couldn't use the right the pronouns for the right language. And she also had just been assaulted. She then somehow managed to get sent to a centre where it was a co-ed homeless shelter. She was very predictably and very tragically then assaulted sexually by several men there. She then was sent back to the other program, the LGBTI, the T and the I as tokens, probably the B as well, sent back there. And now she was really in distress, whereupon they said, she's being difficult, we don't know how to deal with her, and they ended up dropping her at a psych unit. Now, in the middle of all this, I actually tried to intervene. I remember running along a street because there wasn't near a bus line, I didn't have a car, and I just remember saying to them on the phone, you know, can you just please, just wait, just keep her there, give her a cup of tea, I'm coming, you know, I'll sort this out, of course she's distressed. They just didn't wait, they didn't have the skills. And I think this is part of this, is that when we talk about women and men and what women need and what men need, I think we need to be really careful which men, because some of these programs will work for some men and not for others. There are men who are desperately in need of refuge, and there are women who are desperately in need of being included in women's refuge, who, as of today in Australia, most of the women's refuges have not included them. And in fact, in New South Wales, there's even an exemption that allows people to discriminate in this way. So I think I just want to bring that back into the conversation.
Thank you, Garvey. We're going to move on and follow this line of conversation. And